Hello, everybody. Let's see. So you can double click the slides so you can get what do you call it? So you can maximize the presentation that I have, and then we'll go along in a bit. So my name is Maria Mora. My pronouns are they, them, theirs, or if you would prefer, she, her, hers. I have a Twitter account, riamaria.com. And that is also my website. You will be able to reach me there as well after the session, and I will also have the link to the GitHub repository and my slides on my website as well. So a little bit about me. I am in San Francisco, California at the moment. I am a staff security and compliance engineer at Crunchyroll. So I do a lot of like software engineering, but aside from that, I also do some security related stuff. A moment. Okay. And that's my cat over there. So before we get started, before we move on, I'd like to again thank everyone for joining, and I'd like to acknowledge that it's been quite the roller coaster the past who knows how long with COVID and all the different things that we've been dealing with today. So I'd just like to take a quick pause and a moment of silence for the victims of racial injustice and their families, and the victims of injustices around the world, and those who have been affected by the coronavirus. May people find solace and strength. Okay, so let's get ready. So what's on the agenda today? So I'll be giving a quick primer on how we'll be working together, and we'll be having an intro to the sample application, just to give you an idea of how this application should be working. And then we'll basically have free tests, or free steps rather. First off, we'll be writing tests together, and then step 2, we'll ramp it up. We'll be building an API client out of the main sample application. And then the third step is we're going to be using that API client. So everyone, if I could ask you to make sure that you have the project ready on your machines. So I'll give us like a couple of minutes to, make sure everyone gets started. So show of hands, or, please type in the chat if you do not have the project available yet, just to make sure. If you don't have the project available yet, if you don't have it downloaded, you can get it 2 ways. So first off, if you're familiar with, I would like to ask you to clone the repository and check out the branch according to the instructions on the screen. And if you don't have Git, you'll just download a zip file. The particular link that I put up there goes to GitHub, and if you go to the particular page, you'll be able to see this green button. It says clone or download, and depending on whether or not you're using Git or you plan on just downloading the zip file, I would like to ask you to set that up within the next couple of minutes. And I think the important part here is that we have the repository up on the screen. As long as you get the link, you'll be able to set it up as we move on. Okay, so, you know, hopefully you were able to get the link. Mackenzie also shared it in chat. So this is how we'll be working together. So for each step that we have 3 steps. We'll be starting at the project directory. And then we will basically go to a directory. So for example, the step-1 directory. And then we'll have a little bit of a discussion. And then afterwards, we'll have the exercise. And that's going to be a live coding session. And I'll be asking you to follow along. So you can code at your own pace. And there will be a breakout session available for questions, and if you have to share your screen as well. So that's one way we're going to be working together. And if you somehow ran out of time or we couldn't get to as fast as we could because we have to keep moving on, it's okay. We have different directories. You'll be able to save a copy of your file, and then you can just come back to your work later as well. No worries about like getting stuck. Aside from the fact that we have different directories for each step, I made sure to basically have a solution at the end of each step, just in case you'd like to catch up, and then you can just go back to the previous step later on. So I'd like people to just say yes or no in chat. Who here has worked with external APIs before? This is, basically calling another service that's not necessarily in your own application or another application in your system. Okay, we got a lot of yeses. That's great. Okay. So as you might know, we're going to be working with an API. For those who don't know, hopefully you'll be able to follow along. I do have a very simple diagram in the next slide to explain what we'll be working with. So basically, we have our application, and we also have this API in the cloud. And this particular API that I chose is a free and simple application, and hopefully it will work for the purpose of, this exercise. So we'll be, in particular, using the advice slip JSON API. If you go to adviceslip.com, whether or not you do it right now, all that website does is, they give you a particular advice slip, and it's almost like a fortune cookie machine, if you will. So when you make this GET request to api.adviceslip.com/advice, and you could also just go to your browser and type in that particular URL, and if you go to it, it will give you this particular JSON response. So there's going to be an object, it says slip, and then there is a particular ID, it's a numerical value, and then there's going to be a piece of a device written as well. So the way that this particular API endpoint works is that they will give you a random piece of advice. And if you look at the API documentation, they have other API endpoints as well that have other functions, such as getting the different advice slips that you can, like given an ID. But we won't be going over those today. Maybe later on, if you'd like to explore those on your own time, feel free to go ahead and do so. So let's move on. So test. This is for step 1. But before we go into the code, I'd like to introduce a few concepts. So mocking. Before we even get to mocking, I'd like to talk about tests for a little bit. In my head, and I like to use this analogy. When we think about writing automated tests in our own application, it's basically doing a science experiment. We have our hypothesis, which is, the outcome we expect, and then we put in like different variables. We make sure that we give this particular input. We make sure we give this particular input, and then we test that thing that we're testing, the object or the function or whatever. And then we run the test or the experiment. Then we get a particular result, and hopefully we get the expected outcome. So, given that analogy, mocking is, it's another way for us to be able to control the input that we give when we're running a test or an experiment. And I like to think of a mock object or function as an independent variable from a mathematical or experimental context. Yeah, so it's a way that you can control a behavior of a particular object, and you can control the way you can control results basically, and we'll probably understand more of this as we go along the workshop. So request mocking. So this is the first step that we're going to do. So we're going to basically mock the API request, mocking sort of the internet, so to speak. We're mocking the network connection. So it's basically, like having a stand-in for the request and response connection. We're pretending we're not going to connect to the internet to make this to run this test, and instead we're going to make this pretend internet that will always respond with this particular value, and in that sense we'll be controlling that particular variable, and we'll understand this more as we go along. But basically I'd like to explain that the best part about mocking your requests is that when you're running your tests, and for example, it's a unit test and it's not like an end-to-end test where you're testing everything. This is great when you're kind of like quickly trying to check whether or not your application, your function, your object is working as intended. And you might have external dependencies if you do try to connect to the internet, to a database, and you don't mock those things. And this is a good quick way of making sure that your particular logic works. So yeah, let's get on to it then. So we're going to be doing our first exercise. Is there anyone here who has yet to get their particular project? Is there anyone here who hasn't downloaded the project just yet? I'll give you a minute. All right. In any case, okay. So hopefully you'll get that downloaded soon. And, we'll be moving on to step 1, and we're going to be running main.py, or we're going to be working with main.py, and the initial thing that we'll be working on is main-test.py. And I put in a command right here just to show that this is the particular way that we'll be testing things. So let's see if I can share the other screen. Oh. Looks like I can only share one screen at a time, or one thing at a time. So, one of the mods, can I ask one of you to basically share that particular screen? If you have that PDF on hand, just share that particular Chrome tab or something for step one while we move on. So, when everyone gets started, or when you open your application, I would like to ask you to uh, make sure you run, um, make sure you download all the different requirements that you need. So, for example, you'll have to run pip install -r requirements.txt and it's necessary. I can move on. So over here, we'll move to step one, and we have main.py. So just to give a quick rundown, we don't have to worry about get advice schema. This is basically a representation of the object that we are expecting from the API. So it might look a little bit familiar to you if you remember what the structure of the API response looks like. So move on to get advice. And if you go to like line 45, it says if name equals main, we just print get advice. So get advice is the main logic that we are going to be testing today. So there are 3 steps to this particular program, to this particular application. First off, we would like to make the API request, and then we would like to make sure that the advice can be retrieved from the response. So we validate against the response that we get from the API, just to make sure that we can actually get the advice from the response. And then we grab the advice itself, line 40, and then we return the advice. So if you're not too familiar with this, this is basically the F notation in Python, and it just helps you format this particular string. Now, I'm going to open main-test.py, and if you look here, it is empty, but we do have some test names available. And what I basically that I created 3 different functions, and these represent various test cases. And my philosophy when it comes to testing is that we have to test for the successful case. However, we should also make sure that exceptions and errors and, any particular validation errors work as expected. We can't be too complacent when it comes to testing, but, there can be nuances later on as well. So what I did here was that we're also going to be testing what if we get an exception from the API endpoint, or what if something goes wrong over there on their side, and then what if they end up sending us invalid responses. So we're going to be working with that. Let's see here. Give me a moment, please.
Hey, Maria. Can you hear me? We have
Yes?
a couple of questions in the chat. Is it possible to make your code larger?
Oh, okay.
It's just having a little bit. No problem. And then also, which slide should I be on?
So step 1, please. The exercise time slide.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, let's try to make this a little bit bigger. Apologies, everybody. Settings, window. Does this look better for everybody? Okay, a little bigger. Let's go back to settings.
Also, if anyone has a trackpad, I know that you can zoom in with your fingers. I'm not sure if you have a mouse exactly how to zoom in, but this session is recorded and it will be uploaded to YouTube. So possibly you'll be able to like zoom in and capture the screen as well. Okay, it looks like the consensus is that it's a great size. So thank you so much.
Okay, no worries. So first off, we should be able to call. So let's start off with the successful test case, and I'm going to be working off of right. So first, the thing that we have to do is make sure we get to run main.getAdvice, and main.getAdvice would return a particular string. So this is the advice that we're getting. And we should also, this is going to ask us to import main. So we do so. And then when we check for like a particular advice, what we do is we assert the particular string that we get versus, something that we expect. So it would look like assert your advice and then the particular piece of advice. Now for this particular case, I'm going to pull up my notes real quick. I would like to use a quote by Audrey Hepburn, and we're going to put this up here. So we're going to create a constant called advice, and this is basically going to be what we'll expect the program, or for what we'll expect the function to return. So I'll make this a little bit larger. So we're asserting that this particular string equals advice. And I'm going to run the test real quick. Now, apologies because my terminal is pretty small. So I'm going to be running python-m-pytest. Oh, I forgot to go to step-1. So you have to go to step-1 in your particular directory or in your project, and then you can run the test. Python-m-pytest, and it failed. It says here that I got a different piece of advice. Now this is happening because we haven't mocked the request. So we're going to be doing some request mocking. And in the interest of time, I won't be doing all that Googling because I Google as much as the next developer. If you look up the various syntaxes, or if you look up APIs on the internet, if you need references, that's okay. Everybody does it. People that just remember everything straight up, it's not a thing. So we'll be using this particular library called request_mock. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to import it up there. And then we'll be using this particular function called register URI. So the way this works is I put in the get request, or I tell them that it's a get request, and then I copy the URL, this, and then return, it's not return value, it's status underscore code. So we're basically telling this, the mock client to return a status code of 200 OK when we go to this particular URL. And then we're going to ask it to return a particular text. However, just returning the advice doesn't work. So we're going to go to my notes, and then we're going to put together this object, and it's going to be, so this is going to be the response. So we have the response here. It is an object. And then because it is an object, we need to turn it into a string. So we're going to be using the JSON library, and then we're going to be running json.dumps, and then the response. And then we'll also have to import JSON. So if we run this, you notice that I'm still failing. Well, why is that? The reason for this is that this particular assert is not in the correct block. So what we do is we make sure it is in the same block as the mock client to keep it in scope. And if we run this again, it is still failing because, let me look at my notes real quick. Request is mock client. Oh, because we're running, we have to run the actual get advice. I'm sorry, where is it? Here. We need to run the advice after we register the URI. So all of these have to be in the correct block or in the correct scope. So if we run this again, it should work. Now, we also want to be able to test, like, what if there's an exception? So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to be putting together a 500 exception here, or I'm going to respond with a exception rather. And then we probably wouldn't need this response value anymore. So there are multiple ways to do this. For example, we could, let's see. We could use pytest to check if there's going to be an exception that will be returned or raised. And another way is to actually check if we get the correct exception message. And there are multiple ways to do this as well. This is the particular way that I will be running this test. So we will make an assertion that we will get this particular exception message. So error trying to load API. So if you look at line 28 and 29, it mentions that the response code is, if the response code is not 200 OK, then it will return this particular message. So assert error trying to load API equals STRE. Okay, And in the interest of time, I wanted to go over the invalid response exception real quick. So I think I'll just explain this while we're working on step 2. And we'll get back to that later. So going back, you would like to, 1 moment, please. You can stop screen sharing for now, Mackenzie. Thank you. So who here has implemented an API client before? And I would imagine those people who have tried working with APIs, or those who have worked with an API before, they might have implemented an API client before. Okay. So let's go back into some deep coding principles. When I was starting off with my career, I learned Java, and there were a couple of principles that really stuck with me. Some object-oriented principles would include abstraction, encapsulation. There's also inheritance, polymorphism, all of that. I wanted to specifically talk about abstraction and encapsulation. Now, if you remember the code that we had earlier in main.py, we basically just had that one function, and it already does something. Now, we're going to think of this as, it's going to be an exercise of making a particular object. So, we'll have a different module for an API client, and we'll even make a class for it. So the idea here is that we want to abstract away all of that API client logic. And I know of a great book. It's called Codecraft. And this book talks about abstraction and encapsulation. So the idea of abstraction is that you kind of imagine like you have the inner workings of a telephone, but then all of that is kind of abstracted away from you. So you don't see like all the different wires and circuits underneath a particular machine, telephone, computer, whatnot, what have you. And all you see is the casing on top. And you don't have to worry about what's inside as much as, as long as it works. That's great. And basically, it kind of works hand in hand with encapsulation. So encapsulation is just placing everything that, goes into a machine, a computer, a telephone, and you can only, technically you should only be able to interact with it, with that particular thing or object in certain ways that it wants you to. So why do we do this? So from an object-oriented programming sense, there's a great reason for why we want to do abstraction and encapsulation, why we want to build these API clients. First of all, we have less duplicate code. It's really great. And you have a separation of concerns, which is my favorite part of it all. It's going to, having a separation of concerns just makes everything so much simpler. Your code looks like, it should look a lot neater. You'll have simpler tests if you do a lot of mocking. And, you won't have a lot of test cases that could have been placed in a different test that only cares about that particular object. It makes you think, it makes you think about like how to structure applications in an object-oriented fashion. So let's move on to the second step which is implementing the API client. And hopefully it works a little bit better now. So let's move on to, here we go. So earlier we were working with step 1. Now, Mackenzie, can I please ask you to share the step 2 slides? It's time for step 2. So before we get there, I'd like to show you real quick. This is kind of what we were looking at before for the other test. And I wanted to kind of quickly go over this particular test. Test get advice invalid response exception. And this particular test would see whether or not you have like an invalid response. And it would basically, just like the second test here, it would check what your exception message is. So we put in a bunch of different responses. And in this particular case, since we're using pytest, we're basically inputting like different test cases. And one way to do this is pytest.mark.parameterize. And you might have to like look into it later on in the interest of time. And this is a pretty good tool to work with, so you can basically run different test cases, but with the same code, with the same test code. So invalid responses would include, just getting like an array, a JSON array. You can also have an empty object. You can have no ID, no advice, for example. Instead of slip, you get slap, that sort of thing. So you put in all your error cases, and then you can put them together. So we have the advice API here, and we'd like to put together a class that represents the API response. Basically what was in the JSON object we looked at earlier. And we also have the API client itself, and we also have the get advice, get advice function. Now, I added some to-dos in here just so we can go through this quickly. And to the side, I will open main.py. We'll basically be grabbing all the logic from main.py and putting it in adviceapi.py. So open to the side. So we still have get advice schema over here. You're just going to copy paste this, since a lot of programming is actually copy paste when you think about it. Let's be real. So for one, we'd like to have something that represents an advice slip. So let's start with figuring out advice slip or advice slip. And the way that we put together classes, I'm hoping that most of you know Python, is that we just initialize variables in the init function. So at the top of my head, we can put in the ID, which is an integer. And then we also have the advice itself. So what we'll do here is that self.id equals ID and self.advice equals advice. Now, depending on what school of thought you have for Python, you might like to be a bit more strict with regards to data types that you pass in, but that's up to you. So now we have an advice slip object here, which represents the response that we'll get from the API. And then we'll basically just copy a bunch of these things and put it over here. So first, you'd like to make the API request. Also, when we do this, we'll have to import a couple of things. So namely, import request and import JSON schema. Let me turn this off. Okay. Here and down here. And what we're going to do next is we're going to, I think we can keep this together. This is basically the same thing, but we're going to be putting together the advice slip object. So what we're going to do is we're going to get rid of this, and instead we're going to have advice slip. And the way that we'll, the way that we'll be working with this is that we'll just pass in the slip ID and the slip advice. Now, we do hope that the JSON schema validation, when we validate the response from the API, that we'll be able to get get any particular issues along the way, such as we're going to make sure that the slip ID and the advice are all together in that response, so we can trust that these values will exist and they are of the correct type when we put together the advice slip response. Now, what we're going to do next is we're going to be putting together the test here. So I'm going to open it and the side, click right. And apologies if if the screen's a little bit off, like it's too small. So this is my favorite part. When you're like moving code from one place to another to make it better, you do a lot of copy paste and you change some logic here and there. Another way to call this is refactoring, if you're not familiar with the term. Refactoring is an interesting challenge depending on the code that you're working with. And tests, like writing tests, working with current tests, that's very important when it comes to refactoring. And I might be able to talk about it more later on. So if you look at advice API test.py, it basically has the same the same, what do you call it? It has the same test names as main test.py. And you know what? It should just, well, it wouldn't just work. However, a lot of it is going to be similar. So what we're going to do is we're going to import request.mock. You won't be calling main.getAdvice anymore. So we're going to be changing that. We'll also import JSON schema. And then I'm just going to copy paste these. And then turn that off. Okay. So main.getAdvice won't work anymore. So when it comes to sample advice, yeah. Sorry, I should have copy pasted that as well. Okay. And get advice URL. One thing that I forgot to put in advice API.py API client is that we want to put in this URL, and we can pass this along when we're creating the API client object. So what we'll do here is self.url, and then in the init, we will be able to pass in a URL string, and we'll basically initialize that variable. So self.url equals URL. Okay. So if we get advice URL equals this, and what we're going to do first is we're going to be running the API client. We'll be creating the API client here. So I will have to import advice API, advice underscore API dot API client. Yeah. And then to be to keep it like short and simple, we'll be reusing variable values. We'll be copy pasting the get advice URL. We'll be using this particular constant. So now we have the API client here. And then this is going to be a lot simpler. Since the expected message here included like your advice, we're going to just be testing the advice itself. So what we're going to do is we're going to get an advice slip from the advice API or from the API client. And then we're going to assert that the ID is 100. Oh, apologies, Elizabeth. So currently we are in the step 2 directory, and I'm currently in the advice API test.py file. I basically copied a bunch of code from main test.py so I can add it to advice API test.py. You're welcome. So be real quick, and we might have to move on to the next thing real quick, or to the next what do you call it? We'll have to move on to the next step. So we'll see how far we can get with this. So what we did is basically we changed, we copy pasted a lot of code from main test.py, and because instead of calling the original function in main.py, we'll be using the API client. So we created the API client, and we'll be using that particular API client with the requests mocked in the test. Then we'll be running the assert, then it should just work. Now, lucky for us, this should just work. So instead of running main.getAdvice, you should just be able to run API client.getAdvice on here, and it should just do the same thing because we didn't really change the logic. We just encapsulated or abstracted away from the API client. So what I'm going to do here now in my console is that I'm going to change my directory to step 2. Then I'm going to be running the test. Name pytest is not defined, of course, because I forgot to import pytest. Let's try that again. And init is missing advice API. Oh, dot 50. Oh, this should just be return advice slip. So you can take a look at advice API.py later on in the other versions or in the other steps, and that should show you what advice API.py should look like. So I got my test, and unfortunately, we'll have to move on to step 3 to keep up with the time. So given that, let's go back to the slides that I have.
Screen sharing, Maria?
Oh, yes, please. Thank you.
Sorry.
So now that we have all of that put together, the API client, remember that we still haven't done anything for main.py and main-test.py. So this is the final part of our refactoring journey, which is we're going to be using the API client instead of doing all of the bells and whistles that shouldn't be in main.py. So it can focus on being the main application instead of being an API client. So a quick pop quiz. Mocking is equivalent to what variable in an experiment? If you remember my analogy earlier, is it a control variable? Is it an independent variable or a dependent variable? All right, so the answer for this is independent variable. So when it comes to mocking objects, there are a lot of things that you can do with mocking. And, this is different from request mocking, which we worked with earlier. So some features that mocking can do would be, for example, you can just return a fixed value, which is basically what we did for request mocking. When we get connected to a particular URL, or when the mock client gets a particular API request, it will return this particular value, this particular HTTP status code. And then, we could return a value depending on the input. With mocking, we can raise an exception, which you'll see later on. And then we could also make objects or functions that don't necessarily do anything. And this can be pretty useful down the line if you have, if you're trying to simplify the kinds of input that you're adding to the test and you don't want anything going on under the hood for that particular test object. You can also do monkey patching, and that's basically just having this particular mock do all sorts of things, such as return this value when it gets run at this time, and then the second time that this thing gets run, this function gets run, it will return a different value, so on and so forth. You're basically changing the behavior of that particular object, but you're still doing it so you can control the test somehow. And you can make assertions on function calls as well. So if you'd like to assert that this particular mocked function got called once, twice, or not at all, you can do so as well. So we're going to be using pytest mock, which is a wrapper module for the native mock module in Python. So we're going to go back to the exercise, and this time we're going to be running step 3. Mackenzie, can I ask you to show this slide, please? All right, now we move on to step 3, and we have advice API.py right here. It's been put together. We have advice API test.py, and all the tests work. We didn't get through all of that, but this is basically what it looks like. And now we have main.py, and it's still running the same code that we had earlier. However, we abstracted away a bunch of these things. So what's next to do? We just remove a bunch of this logic and replace it with the API client. So we're just going to remove a bunch of these. Ta-da! Isn't that easy? So we are, however, going to keep the URL because we have to pass that along to the API client. So here in main.py, we're going to generate or create the API client. So we'll have to import advice underscore API module. API client. And then we'll have to pass in this URL. And then instead of printing out the advice like this, we'll have to first call the API, and it will take care of all the validation and whatnot for us. So API client dot get advice. So this will return an advice slip, and instead of printing out the advice like this, because we don't have the response body anymore, all you have to do is return advice underscore slip dot advice. And that's pretty much it. There's a lot less code going on. Now, we still have main-test.py, and we still have all of these things right here. So we're going to have to remove a lot of this code, basically. And, I guess what we can do is we can remove the mock client because we don't need that anymore. And we're going to be using the mocker, what do you call it? We're going to be using this thing called mocker, which is part of the pytest mock. I forget the syntax for it. But we're going to be using mocker to mock the API client's response. So what we're going to be doing is mocker.patch, and it's going to be calling advice underscore API client. So we'll just go ahead and import advice API. And we're going to mock the get advice response. And then we're going to return the value, which is we're going to return a value which is supposed to be the advice slip. And, that's something that we can put here together. So when we create the advice slip, we'd want to just pass in the ID. Let's put in 100. Then we just pass in the advice right here. So this is basically what's going to be passed along. I can move that in there. And this should work. And then we will also have to replace, this particular test since we removed the request call from main.py. So one way that we're going to do this is we're going to use mocker again, but instead of returning a value, we're going to be returning an exception. And this is how we're going to do it. One moment. Oh, don't need this. So instead of return value, what I've personally been doing for mocking exceptions would be side effect. And then we can just create an exception right now. And we'll just put in this error message right here. Error trying to load API. So what's going to happen here is that when main.getAdvice tries to run API client.getAdvice, it's going to get this particular exception. And we're going to basically do the same thing for for the final test. So what we're going to do here is we're just going to insert marker into the method signature. And then we're going to send this particular exception. So now that this is getting pretty long, we're going to move this into another variable. I'll just name it that for now. I couldn't think of anything. So instead of error trying to load API, we're basically going to be copying this particular value. And this is basically, this is kind of cheating, but not really. And you can make changes to your code as needed. But this is like one quick way of doing it. We're basically sending this particular exception as a side effect, and we're kind of controlling the method there, basically. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to step 3 and I'm going to run my tests. And they work. So advice API test.py now has the different logic that basically does the request mocking. So advice API takes care of all the API requests. And main.py only has to care about talking to advice API. Okay, so let's go back. Sharing that. So let's do a quick recap. So we basically mock so that we get more precise tests. And then we kind of use object-oriented programming to our advantage so that we can write better tests, simpler tests, have separation of concerns, and then have abstraction and encapsulation on our side as well. Mocking helps with all of this as well. And we learned object mocking using pytest mock, and you could also use a native mock module if you'd like. And there's also request mocking through requests mock. That is, if you use the request module. Now, there are other packages out there that have their own mocks. So, for example, if you work with Amazon AWS, photo free, I've heard of a mock called a mocking framework called Moto, MOTO, and I've used that before as well. So, you're not stuck with just these particular frameworks. There are a lot of packages out there that also have various mocking capabilities. So with regards to recommendations, we do have, and you can get the slides later on and click these links. So there's a particular cheat sheet. This is a Medium article, or rather an article on Medium, and it's one of my favorites. It's saved my butt a bunch of times before. There's also official documentation, and there's also Codecraft by Pete Goodliff. And I highly recommend that book as well. It just has good programming practices all around. If you'd like to kind of brush up on your programming skills and architecture and whatnot. So that's pretty much it for me. Do we have any time for questions? Aside from that, that's pretty much it. Thank you, everybody.